Hey everybody, it's Irene with BrainStormAcres. And as you can see, I have quite the mess on my dining room table. And this mess is because I've been sorting patterns. As soon as our Christmas guests left this year, I decided it was time to get ready to do some sewing. The first thing I needed to do was sort some patterns. Now, this is not everyday sewing. This is historic costumes, so the resources are slightly different. There are a lot of technical books out there that have been printed, that have been put out. They usually mostly come out of the UK, like this one. They'll be on a specific time frame, and they will be teaching you how to make your own patterns. They'll have pictures of authentic surviving garments and embroidery and all that sort of stuff. They'll teach you the basic hand techniques, because remember, there were no sewing machines. And then they'll show you color pictures of people being dressed up properly and what they should look like. And they'll have line drawings of what the patterns should look like and actual patterns that you can size up to create your own patterns to fit you. And they will tell you what size these are here and how to size them up. And when I was talking to Henry about this the other day, I said, well, you know, I do know that some of the people who watch my show, our shows on YouTube do sew. And every once in a while I see someone having problems that I think could be fixed pretty easily. Now, when you're doing historic patterning, you're dealing with a couple of different things. First of all, there's not readily available patterns at the store. The patterns that are available, like Simplicity and McCall's and stuff like that, honest to God, most of these are awful in terms of historical accuracy. They're designed to be Halloween costumes or costumes for theater, and they are generally not constructed with the same techniques that historic costumes were constructed with. Modern patterns often do not take into consideration the value of fabric. They use a lot of facings and interfacings and all this other kind of stuff to bulk up parts like around the neck and stuff like that, to stiffen certain parts of the clothing. And although they did that historically, they were much less generous in general with their use of fabric, because fabric was incredibly valuable. There are historically surviving garments where, for instance, on a velvet outfit, we would be very concerned about the direction of the nap. The fuzz on velvet has a specific direction in which it looks right and a specific direction in which it does not look right. And unfortunately, I know a couple of people who've discovered that the hard way when they were beginning sewists. It happens. I have come close to really screwing something up, but haven't managed to do that yet. Knock on wood, it doesn't happen anytime soon. But that's something they actually did not worry about in historical periods in general, because the fabric was of such great value that you simply made it work. And if you had some sections to your garment that had the nap in the wrong direction, you just didn't worry about it. You were thrilled to have that particular type of fabric. Now, we would never do that modernly. We would want everything to look just a certain way. There are fabrics in the periods that I work with, which is generally pre-1600. There's limited types of fabrics that have stretch. That's not to say that no fabrics have stretch, but your wools and stuff do have some stretch depending on the weave of the wool. So it has almost no stretch that way, almost no stretch that way, although it has a little bit more. But on the diagonal, it does have more stretch. This wool has been heavily washed, so it has less stretch than if it was not washed. even your linens do have some stretch in certain directions. And understanding how fabric works and how it needs to be laid out in order to work correctly is important when you're doing historic costuming. But it's also a handy thing to have on hand in your head when you're doing modern costuming, because it will let you know when you can cheat and when you can't. If I am laying out fabric and there's no nap, it's the same in both directions. There's no fuzz, there's no specific sheen that changes direction when I have, it means I can piece my fabric patterns pieces in there more tightly and worry less about, gee, am I getting, assuming a solid color, gee, am I getting something crazy looking out of this? Is it going to look funny when I sew it together? Obviously, if you have a pattern where you have designs in a specific direction, you're going to have to take that into consideration too. But for my historic patterns, I wind up with a few options, and a few options only. I wind up with things like this, which teach me how to do the patterns by giving me SketchUps. This book here works the same way. You have line drawings of what the various pattern pieces would look like. For this type of dress, you have multiple options for the sleeves, for instance. So they show you the cross section of the sleeve and how it would hang and things like that, and you get to decide which one you want. And then you get to decide how you're going to sketch it all out, size it to your body, and things like that. If you're not up to that, there are patterns much better than Simplicity or McCall's that provide you with actual patterns. I don't know if these people even exist anymore. It's called Costume Connection. But they actually provide you with printed patterns the same way as a Simplicity or a Butterick or anybody else would. And so does Reconstructing History. So does, let me get the name right, Margot Anderson. These are actually patterns. I had this one out the other day. The big difference between this and a lot of modern patterns is that they will have all the sizes on them. So when I used to use, a million years ago, Simplicity and Butterick and things like that, the patterns would usually be one size, or they might be maybe 2 or 3 sizes. This one, I think, has, so yeah, this is 16, 18, 20. Okay. So it'll have 3 sizes in there, and you have to choose your size range. And then you, if you're good at this and you actually follow the instructions, you can figure out how to adjust, because very few human beings are a perfect size whatever. They usually, you look at the information on the pattern, it'll say, bust this, waist that. But the big thing is considering length in here and things like that. That's what makes an outfit fit right or doesn't. When you buy the historic patterns, they usually include all of the sizes. So you see all those gazillions of lines, and you will have to figure out which ones to trace and which ones not to. I normally, in a situation like this where you have all the gazillions of sizes on one pattern, I will normally trace it onto paper. I buy the white craft paper at the old crafty store, and then I make pattern pieces like this where I have traced it out and I have made note of whatever it was, and then I label it. This one's not labeled, but I know what it is by looking at it. I highly recommend putting a lot of written information on your patterns if you decide to trace them like this. And not only, when I say a lot of information, I mean not just where the pattern came from, but any details about seam allowance and things like that. So let me see if I have any like that here. I should. Okay, this is a This is a partlet that has no modern construct to it. Let me see here. Shoulder cape. Okay, a cape that's designed to just go around the shoulders here. It says, shoulder cape for sightless surcoat. It's meant to go with a specific outfit. And I can use it with other outfits, obviously, but it tells me what I was thinking of when I put this together. It also has marked seam allowances. This one is in process, so it doesn't have a bottom seam allowance yet. But ones that have actually been used will normally have more detailed information. This is a surcoat, for instance, which just means an overgown. And it has big floopy sleeves. I can tell by the way the seams are sewed currently as to what the seams were designed to be. This is something you can actually try on. This is a mock-up. And it has all the pieces in it. So it's got all the different side sections and whatnot, because medieval clothing has different construction techniques than modern does. And I know from my own habit that this is the center seam, or the center of the front, because it's actually front panel. And this T means that's where a gore is going to be set into that, which is just another triangular, say, piece of fabric to make the skirts wider. I highly recommend that if you do draft patterns like this, you mark them up thoroughly. And don't mark them with something lightweight. I was actually, what was I going through? I had a bunch of these patterns. At the time, they've come out of various boxes that we've been sorting. They've been made over the process of like 30 years. I have different sources here, so some of them were copies of other people's patterns that they loaned me. Some of them are copies of patterns that I was allowed to copy at events, like classes. And this one, I found the patterns. It was marked as being a specific type of gown. And when I was checking this stuff, I was not seeing any markings at first. And that was because I had written with a really fine pen. It was probably actually a magic marker, but it was as thin as a ballpoint. Don't do that. Get bold. Write big. It should have things that you can read from a distance, like that. Make sure it's an indelible marker that will not wash out easily. I do use erasable markers sometimes when I am doing things. I would never use those sort of things to mark my permanent pattern pieces, because the erasable markers are erased by using heat. So a lot of times people will use them for quilting if they're having a really complex situation and they need to mark the quilting pieces. And then when you iron those pieces, the markings will go away. That's great. You can bring them back. Throw it in the freezer. Okay, so that's tip and trick number one. You can bring those marking pens back by throwing the fabric in the freezer. It can be in a plastic bag. It doesn't need to be just in the freezer by itself. But when you chill it down excessively, then your fabric mark will come back. But you don't want to be looking at a pile of fabric and going, oh Lord, I have no idea what this is. It's obviously a pattern. What is it a pattern for? When I copy something, like if I do a mock-up for one of these, I will, and I've got some over here actually. This is the top of a dress. It got wrinkled because we had an avalanche, courtesy of Miss Isa. But it has the details, and I will be writing. This was my first pencil version, so I will be going over this with a magic marker later. But it gives me all the details about it, how much of a seam allowance I have, everything, how I modified it from the original pattern. And I think that's important if you ever think you might want to make more than one instances of this. For instance, back when my kids were little, I sewed. There was really no Targets and stuff like that in those days. So in order to keep my children clothes, I used to make most of their clothes, because at certain ages, they grow really fast. But you could buy, I had one pattern that was for a little, it actually had snaps in the crotch, and then when they got to a certain age, you didn't have to put the snaps in anymore. But it was a little like overalls, and it had overalls and had regular elastic topped pants in that same pattern. And as the kids would grow, I would simply add more height, because kids, when they're little, grow up for a long time before they grow out very much. And knowing things like that means I was able to use that same pattern for years simply by saying, oh gee, these pants are now too short. Okay, the next time I make that, I need to add an extra inch to the length of the legs. I need to add an extra inch here or a half inch there, and size it up. So I used the same patterns for years, the entire time my son was little, and then until my daughter got to the point where, you know, she wanted something nicer than what mama could make. But it's understanding how patterns work that can really give you insights, whether you're sewing historical clothing or whether you're sewing everyday wear to the grocery store type clothing. The most common problem I see when I just saw a rabbit go flying across the south yard here. Sorry, squirrel? No, rabbit. The most common problem I see when you are trying to sew something, whether it's a sleeve, any kind of a fitted outfit, or whether it's something that's a little looser and flowy, is that whoever they used as a model does not have the same vague dimensions that you do. Over the years, I've participated in a whole bunch of workshops where we helped people who had historic clothing that didn't fit quite right, and they really liked them, and they liked them well enough that they wanted to be able to fix them, but they didn't know what was wrong with them. One of the most common things I see is the bust lines in the wrong spot.